My name is Elyse Wild, and you are listening to Women's Lifestyle Magazine Inspired Voices. Hi, on today's episode, I have a very special guest, Ellyn Clarey, the president of the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council. My guest today is the very special, incredibly amazing Ellyn Clarey, who is the president of the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council. Now, the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council has been documenting women's history for many years here in Grand Rapids. We partnered with them about 3 years ago to create a monthly column in which we feature the story of a woman in Grand Rapids or in West Michigan who made history and had an impact either locally, statewide, nationally, or sometimes worldwide. It's become one of my favorite columns because I learn something new and incredible and inspiring about my own community every time it comes into my email. In the upcoming episode that you're about to listen to, Ellyn tells us all about the local suffrage movement and how it played an impact on the national suffrage movement. And you will hear in her voice how passionate she is, and she speaks so eloquently and richly, and I know you are going to be captivated and engaged, and I hope that this episode prompts you to take a further interest in local women's history. As Ellyn mentions, women throughout history have been behind so much progress and so many historical moments, but have been given credit for so little. And I encourage you to engage with the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council in whatever way you can. Right now, it's probably by visiting their website at ggrwhc.org. That's ggrwhc.org. Sign up for their newsletter. Whenever we are able to have events in person again safely, I encourage you to go to their events. You will learn so much. It's really amazing and it's really fun. And organizations like this are really important so that women's voices throughout history can be elevated and amplified and inspire younger generations. All right, so I hope you enjoy and I hope you learned something. Hi, welcome back to another episode of Inspired Voices. With me today, I have the co-president of the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council, Ellyn Clarey. Ellyn, thank you so much for joining me today. We have, sorry about that. We have known each other for a little while now. We've been running a column in our magazine for about 3 years called Her Legacy. That you and your council provide to us, and it's one of my favorite columns we've ever had. I learn something new every month whenever it's turned in, and it's all about how women in Grand Rapids throughout history have made an impact on our community, the nation, and sometimes even the world. So can you tell us a little bit about the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council and what you do in our community and why your work is important?
Certainly, Elyse. Thanks for doing this. The Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council is a little over 30 years old. It actually was formed in the late 1980s, sort of on the tail end of what we consider second wave feminism, the big feminist civil rights movement coming out of the 60s and into the 1970s especially. And the founder of our group, Twink Fry, was asked by a club to do a talk on women's history in Grand Rapids. She went to the library, she went around looking for information that she could use and came up with nothing. Partly that was because the institutions hadn't thought about looking for women's history in material that was already existing, but partly it was because a lot of that material just had not been dug up, systematized, and made available. Mm-hmm. That is the mission of the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council. So for a long time, we've been looking at women in the professions. You do as much as you can with ordinary women too, but early women's political history, just all kinds of areas. So we've been doing pretty much whatever volunteers have been up for and covering all areas at once and making material available for repackaging for things like the articles in Women's Lifestyle magazine.
And I know, things are a little different right now with the pandemic still going on. But your organization, you guys typically have like pretty dynamic programming. As you said, like including our column in Women's Lifestyle magazine, you do events at the library. You guys speak at, you're asked to speak at a lot of places. You have a newsletter. Right now you have an online suffrage exhibit, which is pretty amazing.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about all of that programming that typically occurs when we're not in the midst of a global pandemic.
Yes, I can tell you it's a little bit depressing when we look at our March hard copy newsletter, which is also available on our website, and just see there's a section, in fact, called Events, 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 that
Oh,
throughout the 2020 year we were using to celebrate the centennial of the 19th Amendment. Everything was leading toward a blowout event at St. Cecilia Society on August 26th, the actual centennial date for the 19th Amendment, which in fact guaranteed the vote for all American citizens. There are some confusions about that, whether race is involved, etc. Whether people can actually vote, whether they have difficulties is another issue. But the 19th Amendment guarantees the vote to every American citizen. So anyway, we just had a whole raft of programs going. And suddenly in mid-March, along with everything else, we skidded to a halt and have had to repivot. I know that you have also gone from print publication to all online, and that's pretty much what's happened to us too.
we were, we were so looking forward to the event in August. I know we had a lot of ideas on how we could leverage our great partnership. And so
Yes.
personally, and I was just very disappointed that was something that was, hit hard by COVID. But that brings us to what we are going to talk about today, which is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and the role that Grand Rapids suffragists played in the statewide movement and the national movement, and some pretty significant suffrage events that occurred in Grand Rapids.
Yes.
So our her legacy column at the beginning of the year, and starting in January, we were planning on kind of telling the story of that through the columns. And obviously, as you said, we've pivoted a little bit and we've brought in some different content covering a little bit of the history of nursing, given the pandemic. And those columns are wonderful too. So let's start with, I've got our names written down here of the women that we've featured so far that relate to suffrage. Start at the beginning. This is your area of expertise, and you and I have had several conversations off the record, and I'm just really excited to bring that to our listeners, because there's just so much that occurred here that is pretty much not documented and not really acknowledged in history.
It's not. And in fact, in Michigan, Elyse, there was never a centennial commission set up. A lot of states set up a 2020 centennial commission and that kind of thing. And there are a lot of national organizations and websites that have been organizing for this. And I have to tell you that the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council represents the state of Michigan on most of them. Because we've actually been working in this field for about 20 years. When we discovered, actually, it was news to me. I've been on the council myself over 25 years, and I knew that the national movement had met in Grand Rapids in 1899. Susan B. Anthony on the stage of St. Cecilia, Music Society, etc. All of the heavy hitters were here. But why was an issue? And I was trying to answer that question in 1999, when we actually performed a dramatization of the meeting in Grand Rapids, which we had put together mostly from newspaper accounts. And I finally came across the name of Emily Burton Ketchum, who was featured in, I believe, the March Women's Lifestyle magazine issue this year. And so it's been a while. We really were getting a lot of information 20 years ago about all of this area, and to some extent have celebrated it, set it aside a little bit, and came back to it this year with some differences, so that we've offered much more than we knew then about how race intersects with the local, state, and national movements, what was going on nationally, why in fact the movement came to Grand Rapids in the first place. So Elyse, we have a lot to talk about today.
Yes, we certainly do. And well, as you said, that in the March edition, that's a great place to, I think it's a great place to start for people that are interested in this topic. And that's available on our website at womenslifestyle.com. But yeah, so tell us about that. So tell us about the event.
Yeah, I think the focus on the 1899 event was written up by Melissa Fox in our May edition.
Oh, yes.
So we can collapse those, the 2 M months, March and May.
Yep.
Emily Burton Ketchum, of course, was central to the event in Grand Rapids. Once she got everyone here, Susan B. Anthony, of course, presided on the stage, and a lot of, the national speakers were here for over a week, April 27th through May 4th, I believe. And so we have a lot of great information about that, where they met, where they stayed for $2 a night, the lovely walks. Melissa Fox discovered that the Bissell, Anna Sutherland Bissell, got people out to her factory, and they were taken in carriages that the Chamber of Commerce supplied, and she supplied little miniature Bissell carpet sweepers that were engraved with National American Women's Suffrage Association, the group's initials, NASA, NAWSA. So there are lots of fun little details like that for when the national group was really here. But for our purposes, it's really more interesting in some ways to know who brought them here and what was going on. Actually, what happened nationally was that there were federal, early on, okay, remember, we're talking about a movement that ended in 1970, even though it had an afterlife in the League of Women Voters, the ERA push, and that kind of thing. But the amendment was made the law of the land in 1920. Typically, the 1848 Seneca Falls Women's Convention, Rights Convention, is considered the starting point. Yeah. There had been agitation previously to that, but in 1848, a lot of women abolitionists got together, realizing when they weren't seated in a big international forum on the abolition of slavery in London, that they had problems of their own. And they came home, and in a tea party near Seneca Falls, New York, decided, we're going to gather women. And it was wildly successful. That's considered the opening shot. But suffrage wasn't even on the agenda. It was really added in later. They wanted women to be able to control their own salaries. Like washerwomen would have to go home and give their husbands whatever money they had earned. And alcoholism was a huge problem in the 19th century, which is why the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was such a big deal among social reform organizations then. So getting rights to children, if a marriage split up, it was more focused on that kind of thing in 1848. At the end, though, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who became the godmother of the movement, its brains, really introduced suffrage as a platform. And there was so much blowback that a lot of women removed their names from the 1848 Declaration of Sentiments.
Wow.
However, it went on. And in 1850, there was the first national meeting held in Worcester, Massachusetts. And until the Civil War, there were annual meetings of I believe it was called, it was Equal Rights something. I should have checked their actual name then. But then after the Civil War, it started up again. And at that point, they had been lobbying both for rights on the state levels and for a federal constitutional amendment. But after the Civil War, in 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed that left women out completely. African American men only were given the vote, and that changed everything. I mean, there were huge fights about that. The suffrage movement split apart, but that's another story. In effect, what happened was that there was no more sense in going after a constitution. Well, I'm going after a federal law. And so state by state efforts started. In the last years, again, they went back to pushing for a constitutional amendment, which is why we ended up with the 19th Amendment in the 1920s. However, in the 1890s, and we're getting up to the 1890 conference in Grand Rapids, they were starting to, it was kind of on the cusp of making a change from pushing state by state, which had not been very successful, and going toward a federal amendment. So they realized that they needed a regional strategy. that they couldn't meet in Washington, D.C. every year and expect to get anywhere. So in 1895, they went to Atlanta, Georgia. They knew they'd have to have Southern states to get the necessary 36 states on board for a constitutional amendment. I believe it was 3/4 of the states needed to sign on. And then 2 years later, they went to Des Moines, Iowa. They knew they also needed more Midwestern states. So Iowa was a kind of test point. So far, the wild and woolly Western states of Idaho, Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. Wyoming was first, but it had enfranchised their women. But the hidebound East Coast wasn't budging. So Iowa and Michigan, sort of in particular, were seen as states where maybe they could prove that American women actually wanted to vote. Mm-hmm. So in between times, they went back to Washington, D.C., and by the next time, 1899, they came to Grand Rapids. So it was really kind of a huge deal. The 1890s, we consider the heyday of the Grand Rapids suffrage movement. Emily Burton was in her prime. She was actually a delegate to all kinds of national meetings. She went to Boston to a suffrage bazaar. She sat representing the state on the National American Women's Suffrage Association's executive committee in 1894, in fact, at a meeting in Washington, D.C. She's pictured with all of the leadership by the Matthew Brady studio, by the way. And she was she spoke for the U.S. Congressional Judiciary Committee in 1894. It was just a huge year. In 1893, in fact, in Chicago, at the Columbian Exposition, the Susan B. Anthony and suffragists were invited for a special showing at the Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. It was a funny moment. They're really interesting ways that they used moments like that in the press. And Emily Burton Ketchum was in person very colorful, but also had a quip for everything. She reported that they took all of this flack for going on a Sunday, and she said, "We loved it. We had the greatest time in the world." Also in Chicago, it was delayed by 1 year. If people aren't familiar with the Columbian Exposition, it would have been the quadricentennial of Columbus's quotes discovery of the New World, but it was in 1893. There was a massive women's building, and Emily Burton Ketchum was invited to speak there, representing the movement and her state of Michigan. So she was a big deal.
Yeah, let's tell us a little bit more. Tell us about her. And she was our Miss March, as we tend to call her.
Yes.
So yeah, tell us a little bit more about Emily.
She was actually from Grand Rapids. Emily Burton Ketchum, Burton Heights, Burton Avenue was her family.
Oh, and okay, yeah. I didn't make that connection originally.
Yep. Cool. And she was born here in 1838 under a Michigan Constitution. You can read in our March piece for Women's Lifestyle magazine. Only white and civilized Indian males were allowed to vote. But she began to work in earnest in 1873, which is when I think of the Michigan movement really taking off and starting. Before that, she had gone to Western New York, which is where family had come from, during the Civil War. And she came back with a husband, Ketchum, who was Smith G. Ketchum, who was an ardent supporter of her and of the suffrage movement. That made so much difference when husbands were on board. There were women in Grand Rapids who would donate to the movement secretly without telling their husbands, but they wouldn't let their names be used. Emily Burton Ketchum and some other leaders just had family support, which was really, truly wonderful. But she first starts showing up then after the Civil War, when in the early 1870s, there was a national push for voting. That's when Susan B. Anthony voted and was arrested in New York. And there were all kinds of interesting interpretations of the amendments, and the 14th Amendment being argued that women actually could vote under it. So there was a lot going on. And both Susan B. Anthony and the brains, who was the soldier of the movement, and her partner Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was the brains of the outfit, were all over Michigan. There are plaques in Rockford and all over the place indicating when they visited those territories. And so in 1873, there was, it was setting up for an 1874 vote in Michigan to strike gender as a qualification for voting. It went down, but it was a statewide campaign where lasting friendships were developed. And that's when Ketchum and Susan B. Anthony definitely became really lifelong friends. And Ketchum was the main, started to become the main contact person in Michigan. So much so that at least in 1892, Susan B. Anthony showed up in Grand Rapids to stand in Ketchum's 25th wedding anniversary welcoming line.
Oh,
so
wow.
they politicized the wedding anniversary, but it was written up in the social pages. Susan B. Anthony wore, I think it was dark maroon velvet, and with a lace shoe and that kind of thing. And they were used to that. They throughout the 19th century, and well, all the way up until 1920, had to put up with attacks in the newspapers, attacks personally, that any woman wanting suffrage was mannish, that they weren't real women, etc. So they were a little careful about their dress and those sorts of things. And in fact, at their meeting here in 1899, the stage at St. Cecilia was set up to look like the parlor of a classy home. There was a full-scale piano on stage, and there were musical interludes. There were flowers all over the stage. There was a sitting room set up. Susan B. Anthony held forth from a desk, and we actually mimicked that in a videotape that we have of our 1999 reenactment.
That's so cool.
Yeah, and so Emily Burton Ketchum, for example, was a bit of a clothes horse. And when she was lobbying in Lansing, there's a newspaper article in the 1890s that quotes her, shaking her finger at a journalist, telling him, "We're not lobbyists," because that would be used against them if that term was used. Of course, they were there lobbying, but it was definitely reported that she wore dusky rose with the matching fichu, et cetera, et cetera. And that's sort of tamed responses to her tongue. She could be, as she said about the Wild West show, we had a rollicking good time. She would actually give quotes about what she'd like to do to those people who did not vote with them. Won't sound politically correct for me to report this today, but she actually said that when women were, of course, relegated to the balcony in Lansing, that she'd like to turn a Gatling gun on all of their opponents down on the floor. So she was a colorful character, but a lady.
That's really interesting. It seems like, so what I'm hearing you say, and also from our conversations in the past, it seems like there were these, as you said, the characters in the suffrage movement that were also very savvy with the press.
Oh, yes.
And to me, that sounds like a little bit ahead of their time.
Yeah.
And
well, sort of. I mean, the thing is, we don't think of, because women didn't have the vote, we sometimes think they didn't do anything. Okay. And of course they did. In fact, the organized movement for the vote for the 19th Amendment really came out of thriving women's club movement coming out of the 19th century. I mentioned that in the early 1840s, these women had gone to London for an international abolitionist conference. They came back and realizing they needed to do more for themselves, and starting with those early women's rights meetings that started in Seneca Falls and moved to Worcester and then continued on. In relation to that, a lot of women's clubs started. In Michigan, a woman from Kalamazoo who somehow briefly became it would be like the dean of women's students at Kalamazoo College, named Lucinda Hinsdale Stone, is called the mother of the Michigan Women's Club movement. And her niece in Grand Rapids, a woman named Marion Withy, after the Civil War in 1868, pulled together a number of women to meet in the basement of Park Congregational Church. And I think the first time they didn't have chairs there, and they sat on rolls of carpeting. After that, their meetings, and this is for a history study club initially. They brought their own chairs and teacups. And they were basically teaching each other, because in the 19th century, women had very few options for a higher education. And so a lot of these early clubs started out, they sound a little bit like contemporary reading clubs, but they would often assign something. Like you might have to bone up on Egyptian cuisine and then tell the rest of us about it.
Oh my gosh.
At one of these meetings. Well, that soon developed into the Ladies Literary Club, which was initially a ladies' library association also. So if you know that grand building down on Sheldon, just south of Fulton, the old ladies' literary club, it was owned by Calvin University until recently. It's an event center now. But basically, they built, raised the money and built in the late 1880s one of the first big clubhouses built actually for a women's club in the nation, certainly in Michigan. And then they are the ones who started the Grand Rapids Public Library, what developed into that. So the Ladies Library Association, if they were going to teach each other, they had to have materials. So they had a house, they had their shelves, they bought books, and which eventually were turned over to libraries. And this just developed into a very prestigious, like women's club in the 1890s. They were still doing a lot of what they had always done, but they had 600 members and there was a waiting list of 600.
Wow.
And you can imagine there were spin-off literary clubs all over the city of Grand Rapids. So we'll just keep the examples local. But almost immediately, the Ladies Literary Club's more musical members spun off and formed St. Cecilia Music Society. By 1895, their more athletic members, and that was a fashion then, let's stay physically fit, had formed the Noon Rest and Women's Gymnasium. Well, the Noon Rest part was a place for women to go and have lunch, and women who worked downtown. So people don't realize how many people were working. A lot of young immigrant women and young women coming in from the country were working in factories, and the Women's Rest, the Noon Rest and Women's Gymnasium, 5 years later in 1900, turned into the YWCA. And their representatives met trains, trying to get young women coming into town, telling them where good places to live would be, getting them to go there for lunch and, getting them off on the right path. Mm-hmm. So there was this huge proliferation of organizations until today. We have so many that, there might be one called the Northwest Kent County Women Attorneys Association.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so in the 19th century, then there are those things locally, but then there were also organizations starting. I mentioned the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the suffrage organizations were going, and a lot of them were hand in glove with these local women's clubs. Well, okay, you've got clubs, you've got organizations, you're handling money. Women were learning Robert's Rules of Order, how to run a meeting, how to organize structurally with officers. They were, in fact, all through those years of the suffrage movement, having to study the legal situation. They had to know how many, when they needed to get petitions in, because remember, the votes that were taken that would enfranchise women on the state level were all taken by men.
Yeah.
Okay. So the women in Michigan, I don't even know off the top of my head how many petitions there were, but or how many votes there actually were, but they delivered petitions annually to the Michigan State Legislature. And just think how much work that was.
Yeah. Wow. That's so also, as you said before, like, there is this impression, I realize that that's the impression I have, that women weren't necessarily organized before the suffrage movement or weren't necessarily engaged civically. But as you described, like, obviously they were.
Oh, yes.
Very, very much so.
And in fact, a woman on our board, Ruth Stevens, has, in our March newsletter, we have a page dedicated to her touring Southwest Michigan. She's been doing a lot of she was doing a lot of conversations. And in fact, on July 28th, she will continue a program virtually for Saugatuck Douglas, where she's been telling groups a little bit of their own history and how the suffrage movement impacted Niles and Dowagiac and all of these various places. But a lot of what she's talking about is the very early part of the movement. And in the early years, a huge effort was made to give women municipal rights. Okay, women who were paying taxes, the ability to vote on local sewer bills, It didn't work very often, but schools were the biggest issue because of mothers. The gender roles were exceptionally important, especially to men, but also to women. And so very early on in 1867, the Michigan legislature allowed cities to allow their women to run for school boards. And if they could run, or I used to vote on school board, and if they could vote, they could run. It's a very complicated history, which attorney Ruth Stevens has been working out for us, but it's complicated. So just to use Grand Rapids as an example again, not until 1885 were women in Grand Rapids allowed to vote or run for school board. And that's because the bigger cities had to go to the legislature and ask them to change their city charter, etc. And Grand Rapids just didn't get around to it for nearly 20 years. But by 1887, women in Grand Rapids were running. And of course, they were all hand in glove with local suffragists. In 1888, the first woman ran. And actually, Elyse, that's another area of study that we have really dived into. We have a draft of Grand Rapids' entire history of women who've run for office. We're getting it double and triple sourced. And by sometime this summer, we will have another page on our website reporting on and making available spreadsheets and all kinds of information about the early years. Yeah. So between 1887 and 1920, in a nutshell, 47 different women ran for school board in Grand Rapids, and in 82 different campaigns. So from 1888 on, there was virtually always a woman on the school board in Grand Rapids. And in 1899, there were 3, which made national news.
Wow, that's quite a lot.
Well, and so that gets integrated. So women who were, in the suffrage movement were also doing a lot more. They were in anti-child slavery leagues, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of enough about that. But these women were sharp cookies. And they also knew how they could participate as American citizens, even without the vote. Mm-hmm. They lobbied, they affected legislation. In 1884, New York, for example, which is where the Seneca Falls meeting was, they got a Married Women's Property Act passed, where women could actually inherit from their families without having to turn it all over to their husbands. If they made any wages, they still had to turn them over, etc. So it's a hugely complicated legal history, which is why the 19th Amendment was absolutely necessary, and which is why the Equal Rights Amendment is still necessary. Mm-hmm. Everything regarding women's lives today is still run by legislation, which can be given one day and turned back the next.
It's hard to imagine a world where a woman would have to turn over wages to her husband, but it's even harder to imagine a world in which, like, people advocated for that to not be the case and had to, engage in legislation making and, engage civically to give, allow women these rights that today is just, I don't even want to say enjoy, because, it's rights and rights.
And here I'm going to give my age away and tell you that when I was coming of age, I very much was shaped during second wave feminism. I was a little, I certainly was not Gloria Steinem's age or, the age of those leaders. But I can tell you that when I was an adult, in 1971, women could not get mortgages in their own name or credit cards.
Wow.
So we're not talking very long ago.
Yeah.
That's basically, I could get myself into hot water here, but I think it's all legislatively, approved. So there's still a fight in all kinds of areas, as we know. And I think we should, in fact, especially given recent events, be sure that before we're finished up today, we talk about race in the movement. And we won't talk a lot about race in the national movement, though there's a wonderful new book out by a woman named Ellen Du Bois. It's called Suffrage. That's before the colon. And she really brings to bear all of the latest research and what we know on in the terms of the national movement. And she handles the fight in 1870 when the suffrage movement split, because part of it supported the 15th Amendment, where women would be, from Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton's viewpoint, thrown under the bus. by their old friend Frederick Douglass, and those friendships were mended, but there were ugly moments then. But the biggest moment for race history in Grand Rapids was in 1899 during the NAWSA conference, the meeting of the National American Woman AN Suffrage Movement Association. A woman who lived in Bay City, named Lottie Wilson Jackson, was, as far as we know, the only African American woman who was registered at the convention. And she was there because she was part of the Bay City organization, but she also was part of the relatively newly organized National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And so she spoke up as their representative and put forward a resolution against African American women having to ride on, like in smoking sections of railroad cars. This, of course, was in the peak of the Jim Crow era.
Yeah.
And if you don't know your Reconstruction history, it was over. And there was a big civil rights bill that that was dead, I believe, even by 1875. And that's when privileges that had been given to African Americans started being chipped away at. And partly because the railroads were private companies, the laws and customs of different southern states was different. It was set aside, but it was also a political move because they needed those 36 southern states. They needed a southern strategy. And in fact, in 1920, Tennessee was the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, and I believe it was by one vote.
Wow.
So that's how close it was. So this is it's not a nice history. But so Lottie Wilson Jackson's resolution was set aside, and we'll be doing more on that in an upcoming Women's Lifestyle magazine piece. But we also have a fabulous digital suffrage exhibit on our website. There's a nice teal button at the top of the homepage that says suffrage, and you can get to it from there. But there's a feature on just Lottie Wilson Jackson and this particular resolution. There's another vignette feature on the conference in 1899. So you can look at our Women's Lifestyle magazine features and get a little bit further information there. But behind that Lottie Wilson Jackson appearance in 1899, there'd been a lot going on. And in Grand Rapids, for example, the married ladies, and this was written about in your February issue, a piece by my co-president, Sophia Brewer. In our February feature for Women's Lifestyle magazine, written by Sophia Brewer and wonderfully illustrated, as usual, by Libby Vanderploeg, yes, you learn a lot about Mary Roberts Tate. She was a founder in 1894 with Emma Ford of the Married Ladies 19th Century Club, an African-American organization which was formed 2 years before the national group I just mentioned, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, and 15 years before the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People.
Wow.
Yeah, so they were really active, and you'll find them in the newspapers, okay? It's not correct necessarily that anybody was left out of the newspapers, that might have changed later. But in the 1890s and early 19th century or early 20th century, you can track the married ladies. By 1898, they had a wild editorial I believe it was in the Press attacking the Herald, or it was the other way around. One of the Grand Rapids newspapers had reprinted an editorial from a North Carolina newspaper laying out all of this false information about blacks wanting to take over the country and their states, and how much power they had and all that kind of thing. Sounds familiar. And they refuted it point by point. But they not only were in the press for that kind of thing, the married ladies, and there were starting to be other clubs, were on the women's club pages with everybody else. So you could read about the Married Ladies Club who met at so-and-so's home last week, and so-and-so sang a solo, et cetera, et cetera. So they were featured. And we know from another newspaper article that in 1907, there were 5 African-American women's clubs out of a total population of 700 African-Americans in Grand Rapids. So Mary Roberts Tate then in 1907, there were 5 in 1907 who hosted the State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs in Grand Rapids. The mayor started. There was a lot of cooperation then. Evening meetings were at Park Congregational Church, and the whole community was invited, etc. Mary Roberts Tate herself lambasted the Jim Crow, the North, for being blasé and passive about encroaching Jim Crow. At a Park Church Sunday school class that made it into the papers. But in 1906, the month that Susan B. Anthony died, she was one of 4 speakers at the White Ladies Literary Club, the most prestigious club in town, for a memorial service for Susan B. Anthony, representing her, and it said, quotes, colored women's clubs. So they were involved. They were in support of suffrage. Emma Ford's husband ran a men's African-American group that voted in support of women's suffrage. So we're just starting to put together a lot of this history, and the local case stories can lead the national story sometimes when it comes to this kind of thing.
Wow, that's so there obviously there's a lot. This is a very rich history, and as I mentioned before, it's really, you know, a lot of when we talk about women's history, you know, a lot of times we view it through the lens of the national suffrage movement, and it's really neat to see these, you know, because it is those local community movements and that make up the statewide movements, that make up the national movements. It's really fun to see the role that these pretty incredible women in Grand Rapids had, and it's also really, you know, it is so, for me, it's really inspiring to hear about all the ways in which women participated and advocate and, you know, and changed society before they had the right to vote.
Oh yes.
While they were, you know, and just the cleverness and the passion is really inspiring.
You know, one thing we haven't mentioned, Elyse, is that there were so-called radical and conservative movements among women all through the late 19th century also. I think it was in 1892, the Ladies Literary Club made the newspapers because they were running 2 slates of officers, a radical slate and a conservative slate. I'm pretty sure that language was used. The conservative slate won, but I believe Emily Burton Ketchum was running on the radical slate. And that gets mixed up in the national as well. Both the UK and the US movements had very strong movements coming out of the 19th century that had radical offshoots, more radical offshoots in the 20th century. And then it was kind of seen that they were, you know, always at loggerheads. But just to make one point, Susan B. Anthony would have been seen as a radical early on. And later, her movement was seen as the conservative movement.
That's interesting. Wow.
So yeah, it's really a crazy history.
So tell us, and we're going to, you know, continue, the columns will continue to touch on the history of suffragism in Grand Rapids, and of course people can go to your website to see that pretty amazing exhibit. And we are so saddened to have the August celebration.
Yes.
And do you guys, do you have a date for that rescheduled yet?
You know, at this point, we don't see any way to plan, even in the fall, to bring together, like how, we really don't know. We aren't comfortable recruiting people. Come on, 700 people strong for a big reunion and celebration at St. Cecilia. We actually have a date that we could use in the spring. We really don't know. We had a bus tour that the Athena Council of the Chamber was sponsoring that has been postponed for a year until next spring. A public museum artifacts tour that we hope will still occur at some point. Whether a centennial blowout as such will occur, I'm not sure. However, we are pivoting. We're talking now, the board of the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council is talking about what we can do in August. And we're possibly going to try to get organized to come up with the locations of grave sites of local suffragists and ask people to take flowers on August 26th. We've also been finding a number of Readers Theater productions that could be Zoom exclusives where people could participate perhaps. So we have a few ideas about how to celebrate virtually. But as I said before, it's not like everything stopped on August 26, 2020. In fact, we have been instrumental in bringing in the Constitutional Day speaker for the Howenstein Center on September 24th, a woman named Paula Monopoly, who has a book coming out in August on the fight to get the 19th Amendment instituted during the 1920s. So we'll have a lot of business to keep up with, both virtually and in person when we can get back to that. We're guessing that the Hollyhock Lane Parade in Grand Rapids on July 4th will probably be canceled this year. If not, we'll think about whether we can do a socially distanced entry. We usually do march in that and invite people to join us. We've been putting virtual tours on our website. We have another little landing page for those. And we're also probably going to invite people July 16th out to Rosedale Cemetery in Sandale to Emily Burton Ketchum's gravesite for a socially distanced event on her birthday. It'll probably be pretty casual. So we're not entirely sure. But so Women's Lifestyle magazine features remain exceptionally important. And we'll try to keep everybody reading those. People can sign up on our website to receive our newly revived hard copy newsletters and our weekly Women's History Wednesdays. That was one of our pivots to really just getting ourselves out there electronically a little bit more often. So like you, we're pivoting in that direction, and we will be mutually concerned in a lot of it.
Yeah, we're living in a COVID world, and although the governor has, as of our recording, the governor has lifted some of the restrictions as we move on to a new phase, but it certainly doesn't mean the virus is gone, and we still need to take precautions, and we are still, operating, within our pivot.
Yes.
And, I encourage everybody who's listening at the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council. The work you do is so exciting. Beyond it, it's just fun. I'm someone, obviously I work in kind of the business of storytelling, and I love reading the columns and just learning more about, it's so inspiring to read about women who existed in a world in which they had a lot of restrictions placed on them, and the things that they were able to accomplish. So I encourage everyone to sign up for the newsletter, to go to the exhibit, to volunteer if that's something that, if you guys are in need of volunteers.
Oh, yes.
And to read the Her Legacy columns. They are on our website, and we do have we just changed our web server, so we are having some organizational issues. It used to be on our old website, you could type in Her Legacy, and it would just bring up Her Legacy columns. Now, if you type in Her Legacy, it brings up every article where the word "her" was mentioned, which is a lot of them as a women's magazine. So we're working on that. And they are, as you said, beautifully illustrated by Libby Vanderplug, and that's been really fun to kind of to see those women represented in this really beautiful illustration form. And Joellen, before we part ways here, aside from being fun and from being inspiring, can you talk a little bit about why women's history and bringing it to the forefront and is important, why it's an important thing to focus on?
It sounds trite and it sounds repetitive to say that, we still need women's shoulders from the past to stand on, but we do, for the same reasons that any history is important. The old bromide, if you don't know the past, you're doomed to repeat it, is certainly true here. Also, we want women integrated into community and national histories. The only way to do that is to create a powerful wedge that you drive in and eventually force an integrated history to be written of our nation and of our communities. I can tell you one quick example. In another supportive husband, Dwight Goss, in 1906 or 7, wrote a big 2-volume history of business in the city of Grand Rapids. In one sentence of a paragraph summary of 1899, it was mentioned that the National American Women's Suffrage Association met here. That's it.
Wow.
Even though it filled the newspapers for the 2 weeks they were here, for months, it was an amazing piece. But on the other hand, we had major reports of the Republican Lincoln's Day dinner that year. And sweet Smith G. Ketchum, guy that he was, supportive of suffrage, it practically reports that he sneezed, when he was delivering. So women just categorically were not considered important, and their doings were not considered important, even though they raised the monies for hospitals, as we've been reporting in your pages, et cetera, et cetera. So that's pretty important to get corrected. Vermeris, our member, but back in July, Ruth and Steve will be doing a really fun piece on the 1914 takeover of the Grand Rapids Press by the Grand Rapids suffrage movement. So yeah, stay tuned. This will be fun.
I am so excited for that one. You've talked about that quite a few times, and it sounds like so fun. And it is amazing to me how little was documented about all of this. And I'm so glad that we get to be a part of just bringing it to the community, so it can be part of our community-wide knowledge. That's a really important thing.
And we thank you for that. You're an essential worker.
Thank you. As are you. All right, Joellen, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye, Elyse. Delighted.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. To listen to more Inspired Voices episodes, to read exclusive online content, and to access our digital/print edition, please visit www.womenslifestyle.com.